Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to keep chewing on the new career of Jonathan Peugeot as a celebrity theist. I don't, I'm going to have to talk to Jonathan about this new turn of his YouTube life, where he had a very interesting, well, frustrating for a lot of parties, conversation with Stephen Woodford, Mr. Rationality Rules, and then another conversation with Adam Friended, which I think many of us found a little bit more interesting, but probably that's some bias on our part because Adam has been a part of this little corner of the internet for a while. But Adam, in terms of sort of the boundary lines in this little corner of the internet, there's Jonathan Peugeot for a long time was someone that some people that I would talk to did not want to talk to. And Jonathan Peugeot didn't really pursue some of these conversations. And I think there's a degree of Protestantism at work in there. But what was true of both of these conversations was the question of where's the difficulty. And then the argument starts talking about frames. Now, that's rather a strange word to use, and so we shouldn't use it unself-consciously. Framing has been something that has arisen since the rise of artificial intelligence. And I don't know if I have a little camera here. I don't right now. It's over in the other room. But my point that I've made often is that a camera cannot see. Well, a camera can take in light, and a camera can transmit and can take that light and put it into electrons and send it into my computer, just like this camera that I am looking at right now is doing. But the camera can't see in the way that I see. There is an interior life going on when I look at this camera that we at least assume the camera does not have. If the camera and all of this electronics did have it, I just finished my conversation with Poe the person, and I just posted that, so that's now available before you see this. But we have this strange relationship with consciousness and with suffering. If we were to somehow believe that all of our electronics, I mean, this little, I'm working on a Sony A6400 right here. This Sony A6400 has a fair amount of electronics built into it. If we would imagine that this had sufficient electronics built into it, that it had some degree of consciousness, and that in that consciousness it had some degree of suffering, well, we might feel a little bit different about how we handle these cameras, or maybe we wouldn't, given the fact that we know that cows and other of the animals that we consume, and I am not a vegan or a vegetarian, animals that we consume have consciousness, and so we kill them in a quote-unquote humane way, but we snuff out their little consciousness in order to enjoy a good steak. So there's a lot going on here, but the frame question is one of, well, what are we even talking about when we're talking about frames in this conversation? Why did Stephen have trouble understanding Jonathan? I don't know that Jonathan has trouble understanding Stephen, but I know that Jonathan is frustrated in his ability to communicate that which he is believing and asserting and living within in many ways to Stephen and his audience. And I think the same thing with Adam and his audience. And so frames is sort of the way that we're talking about this lately. And so I think we need to talk about frames. So again, what I do with these monologue videos is I think out loud, and I think out loud for my own reasons. And over the course of these last 3 years, I've developed language and understanding, and yeah, just trying to figure this stuff out. Now we grow in our groups interpretive pathways. What do I mean by that? I mean, I was born into a nuclear family, my parents, a religious tradition, sort of Dutch Calvinist Christian Reformed tradition, a neighborhood, Paterson, New Jersey, a time, middle of the 20th century, on and on and on and on. And we absorb, we human beings, I've been thinking a lot about this non-player character capacity that we have, and we might be frustrated and dismissive about it, but it's an enormous power how we absorb and manage to integrate the things that we absorb with our genetic systems. And this is Brett Weinstein's genetic and culture track, how we absorb these things and we integrate these things and we participate in them, and we do it automatically. We do it from before we are born and then into the world very quickly, and we learn and absorb. And I mean, it's really important to, you know, to live in cultures other than the ones in your bubble, because you see all of the ways and that children absorb these things and grow in these things, and on we go. So bit by bit, we piece together the world to fit our needs and our wants, and we find our way in our communities. And that's sort of the process of growing and maturing. Now, Mary Cohen recently had a conversation with Manuel, also known as Iron Root, who spent a lot of time on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server and sort of gone over to the Vervaeke Awakening from the Meaning Crisis server. Again, I started this new room, called it The Truman Show. Now I'm talking about it as the open studio in the Discord server, where right now there's a whole bunch of them sitting there with cameras on. It's a little weird. I'm sort of getting used to it, but I'm also finding some benefits and some stumblings about it. But it's just kind of playing around with this new toy in a new way. Anyway, so Iron Root and Mark Lefebvre, along with Mary, had a very interesting conversation on parabolic knowledge. And I remember when Mary first started talking about parabolic knowledge, I was thinking about parabolas as in a math, and I'm thinking, how does this work? But it's parables, it's parabolic knowledge. And she told this little story that, again, I mean, this is why I often don't think I'm all that smart, because I hear these things and I don't get them right away, and they need sometimes hours and days and weeks and months and years to sort of marinate in my head, and then so they bubble up. It's all that absorbing thing. Maybe I don't absorb as fast as I did when I was a kid. I'm sure I don't. But Mary notes, like, a child will say something like this: Daddy is the knife, Mommy is the fork, and I am the spoon. And it's like, well, that's funny. Or boys are dogs and girls are cats. And now we hear that, and we sort of get an idea about what the child is saying, and we can connect with it. But, you know, Mary then goes on to ask, well, what kind of thing are we doing? Well, we're setting up these relationships, and we're looking at patterns. And again, you go into the Vervaeke thing, there's cognitorial explosion, and there's relevance realization, and there's the 4 P's of knowledge, and Manuel and Mark have done quite a bit of work on the 4 P's of knowledge, and they talked about, you know, it makes, oh, I got to hang out that Discord, I got to hang out at the other Discord server more, and I got to really catch up on more of John's videos, and there's not enough time in the day to catch up on all of this stuff, but really good and interesting and helpful work is going on. But talked about the left brain as being propositional and procedural, and the right brain as being perspectival and participatory. And in many ways, Mark and Manuel are digging beneath Vervaeke's 4 Ps, and Mary now has her parabolic knowledge, which is that another P? I mean, how do we integrate these things? But they're all sort of floating out there, and we're dealing with them. But, you know, where does this knowledge come from? Boys are dogs and girls are cats. Daddy's the knife, Mommy's the fork, and I'm the spoon. And again, you can listen to that. Well, that's just a little fairy tale, but that's the point. These parables, these fables, these fairy tales, they're all trading on something. I read a very interesting paper that came out, a blog post that came out when Jordan Peterson first sort of rode the wave about Jungian collective. Oh crap, I can't remember it. Corrective unconscious, and he was dealing with that in terms of some of the adaptations that Jordan Peterson had made to it. And I really want to read that paper and do a video just on that paper, because it's with all of my renewed, oh gosh, I mean, the last 3 years have changed. They haven't just changed my life in terms of a community that I'm around, and you know, all of the changes in my life that this channel has brought me in a way. They've continued to sort of accelerate my thinking and help me think about, you know, what does spirit mean? I've talked about that a lot in recent videos, and if we're going to keep using this word spiritual, we should really do some work on what we're talking about, and this gets into the miracles conversation and all of that. Well, we have this parabolic capacity with these. We're able to intuit relationships, and there are. This gets into, well, how in fact do we appropriate the world and create mental maps of it and engage with it, and create shared mental maps of it, and in fact communicate things to each other that we are not able to know, that sort of slide past the consciousness yet get embedded in our minds. And Jordan Peterson, of course, with the evolutionary stuff, talks about stuff up from the bottom. Lobsters. Poor bucko needs a little shot of air. Yeah, I should really read that paper, but I don't want to distract myself too much in this video to go there. But there's a lot going on with us that we're not conscious of, and we see that around us, and we see that in children especially. And Mary is, would she even be insulted if I called her old and wise? But she is old and wise, and if age does not give you wisdom, then you've not spent your time well. And Mary is just such an astute observer, and she is so wise, and she's also a lot of fun. Now, a while ago, I had read this line in Peter Brown's Through the Eye of the Needle, where anthropologist Clifford Geertz was quoted about common sense, and common sense really triggered something in me, because common sense is sort of like this parabolic knowledge. It's this way that we operate that has in some ways lost status against science, but in other ways is far more enduring, and in that sense is closer to religion. It's going to be part of my argument here that the whole discussion has been generally miscast, and that the issue is not whether there is an elementary form of science to be found in the Trobrians or an elementary form of law among the Barotse, or whether Totemism is really a religion or cargo cult really an ideology, questions which seem to me to turn so completely on definitions as to reduce without residue a matter of intellectual policy and rhetorical taste, but to what degree aspects of culture are systematized at all in such places. And so, this is where sort of Mary's parabolic knowledge comes in. How are we systematizing these patterns that we notice? And even a little child, boys are dogs and girls are cats. Daddy's the knife, mommy's the fork, and I'm the spoon. Well, what about knifeness is like daddy? What about forkness is like mommy? What about spoon is like baby? And you can, again, there's combinatorial explosiveness in this in lots of different ways, and for a particular child and a particular manifestation to get this in, but common sense and the little aphorisms and sayings that go along in common sense are really critical to this. In attacking that problem, an effort more promising than searching for existential definitions of art or science or religion or law, and then trying to decide whether the Bushmen have any, I want to turn to a dimension of culture not usually conceived as forming an orderly realm in the way these more familiar districts of the soul do. I mean common sense. And now, again, it's very interesting why, well, when you think anthropologist, what do you think of? Well, just look at the cover of this book. You've got some masks from another culture. Basically, we try to gain perspective on our culture, which is sort of this continually this continual network of cultures that consumes and colonizes, and it's a very, the imperial culture that we participate in continues to consume and destroy the cultures of the world. And you find in the Bible this idea of one world government, and you get the sense of one culture just moving out and consuming and absorbing, and basically it's a very genocidal thing that we participate in. There are a number of reasons why treating common sense as a relatively organized body of considered thought, rather than just as anyone clothed and in his right mind knows, should lead on to some useful conclusions. But perhaps the most important is that there's an inherent characteristic of common sense thought precisely to deny this and affirm that its tenets are immediate deliverances of experience, not deliberated reflections upon it, knowing that rain wets and that one ought to come out of it, or that fire burns and one ought not to play with it, or to stick to our own culture for the moment, are conflated into compromise one large realm of given and undeniable, a catalog of in-the-grain-of-nature realities so peremptory as to force themselves upon any mind sufficiently unclouded to receive them. Yet this is clearly not so. No one, or no one functioning very well, doubts that rain wets. But there may be some people around who the question of proposition that one ought to come out of it, holding that it's good for one's character to brave the elements, or actually in Paterson, New Jersey, we had a house next to us. The two houses next to me growing up were condemned at one point and became heroin shooting galleries and all sorts of things. But there was a Yugoslav immigrant family right next to me growing up, and when it would rain, there were a whole bunch of them living in that two-story. Paterson had these two-story houses, had a big lip in their backyard, and when it rained, they'd come out with the soap in their underwear and bathe in their backyard. My Dutch spinster neighbors on the other side would look in horror at this, but, why waste the rain when it comes out and you've got 15 people living in a house with 1 or 2 bathrooms? When the rain comes down, take the bar of soap out and scrub it up dub. Common sense, right? Hatlessness is next to godliness. And the attractions of play with fire often, for some people usually, override the full recognition of the pain that will result. Religion rests its case on revelation, science on method, ideology on moral passion. But common sense rests its on the assertion that it is not the case at all, just life in a nutshell. The world is its authority. Isn't that interesting how this works? The analysis of common sense, as opposed to the exercise of it, must then begin by redrawing this erased distinction between the mere matter-of-fact apprehension of reality, which so often certain kinds of atheists like to imagine that, well, being's just obvious. Well, common sense isn't just obvious, is it? But it functions in cultures sort of like fibers function in rope. There's another parabolic idea. The analysis of common sense, as opposed to the exercise of it, must then begin by redrawing this erased distinction between the mere matter-of-fact apprehension of reality, or whatever it is you want to call what we apprehend merely and matter-of-factly, and down to earth colloquial wisdom, judgments, or assessments of it. When we say someone shows common sense, we mean to suggest that he is just using, we mean to suggest more than that he is just using his eyes and ears, but is, as we say, keeping them open, using them judiciously, intelligently, perceptively, reflectively, or trying to, and that he is capable of coping, come on, page turn, with everyday problems in an everyday way with some effectiveness. Again, Sevilla, not enough people listen to Sevilla, including me. Probably don't listen to her enough, but her work on Pirsig has been, barking up this tree all along. So we perceive values, and then we sort of instantiate these values in common sense sayings, and we pass them around, and sort of like daddy is the knife, mommy is the fork, and I am the spoon, or boys are dogs and girls are cats. Something we're seeing through. Again, this is C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. The waterfall isn't just pretty, it's sublime. We're seeing through it to something. And when we say he lacks common sense, we mean not that he is retarded, that he fails to grasp the fact that rain wets or fire burns, but that he bungles the everyday problems life throws at him. So you see this, the thing about the 4 Ps is that they do all sort of come together, and probably way more. He leaves the house on a cloudy day without an umbrella. His life is a series of scorchings. He should have had the wit not to merely avoid, but not to have stirred the flames for it in the first place. The opposite of someone who is able to apprehend the sheer actualities of experience is, as I have suggested, a defective. The opposite of someone who is able to come to sensible conclusions on the basis of them is a fool. And the last has less to do with intellect, narrowly defined than we generally imagine. As Saul Bellows, thinking of certain sorts of government advisors and certain sorts of radical writers, has remarked, the world is full of high IQ morons. This analytical disillusion of the unspoken premise from which common sense draws its authority, that it presents itself neat, is not intended to undermine the authority but to relocate it. If common sense is as much an interpretation of the immediacies of experience, a gloss on them, as are myth, painting, epistemology, or whatever, then it is like them, historically constructed, and like them, subjected to historically defined standards of judgment. It can be questioned, disputed, affirmed, developed, formalized, contemplated, even taught, and it can vary dramatically from one people to the next. This reminds me of, it was in right where I began with Jordan Peterson. It was Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. These cultural layers, and you see this, again, this is parabolic knowledge. You see this in the Gospels, where Jesus has these parables, and these parables go out, and these parables, now to Tom Holland's point about, the most successful short story writer of all of human civilization, these parables go out to radically different civilizations and radically different times and radically different places, and they sort of work. And whereas a lot of interpreters in the scientific mode that want to sort of nail down all of Jesus' parables into certain things. And so we line them up with the Old Testament, do all this grammatical, historical interpretation, which, again, I'm not throwing under the bus, but doesn't lend itself to this much more human way of figuring out how life works. It is, in short, a cultural system, though not usually a very tightly integrated one, and it rests on the same basis that any other system rests: the conviction that those by whose possession it is of its value and whose possession it is of its value and validity. Here, as elsewhere, things are what you make of them. And then he'll get into some philosophy and some other things. This makes me want to chase down Postman. Kindle is wonderful. I found it. Well, what are we talking about here? Now I depart from Fry, who I am certain would raise no objections, but I take his word along with me. Every medium of communication, I am claiming, has resonance. For resonance is a metaphor writ large. Patterns, resonance. That's what resonance is. Somebody sent me a very interesting video on vibration. He said, it's all vibrations. And yeah, vibrations are patterns of what? And that's just our latent materialism. They have to be patterns of something. Well, patterns of, and we can get all spooky, energy or wooey. Whatever the original and limited context of its use may have been, a medium has the power to fly far beyond that context into new and unexpected ones. Of course, this is Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he's dealing with the rise of, in his day, the rise of cable television. That's gone supernova. Because of the way it directs us to organize our minds and integrate our experience of the world. It imposes itself on our consciousness and social institutions in myriad forms. That's what the media does. Media, remember, is plural of medium. And pay attention to the resonance of that word. It sometimes has the power to become implicated in our concepts of piety or goodness or beauty, and it is always implicated in the ways we define or regulate our ideas of the truth. To explain how this happens, how the bias of a medium sits heavy, felt but unseen over a culture, I offer 3 cases of truth-telling. The first is drawn from a tribe in West Africa that has no writing system, but whose rich oral tradition has given form to its ideas of civil law. When a dispute arises, the complainants come before the chief of the tribe and state their grievance. With no written law to guide him, the task of the chief is to search through the vast repertoire of proverbs and sayings to find one that suits the situation and is equally satisfying to both complainants. That accomplished, all parties have agreed that justice has been done, that truth has been served. Think about how America, for example, is going to deal with the conflict over its current election. Who really won? You will recognize, of course, that it was largely the method of Jesus and other biblical figures who, living in an essentially oral culture, drew upon all of the resources of speech, including mnemonic devices, formulaic expressions, and parables as a means of discovering and revealing truth. As Walter Ong points out, in oral cultures, proverbs and sayings are not occasional devices, they are incessant. They form the substance of thought itself. Thought in an extended form is impossible without them. It consists in them. There's this parabolic, local knowledge, common sense level to our culture that things are sort of based upon. Well, what is a just way to deal with the question of did Donald Trump or Joe Biden win the election? Well, courts and evidence. No, it's all fixed. I saw the video on TV. To people like ourselves, any reliance on proverbs and sayings is reserved largely for resolving disputes among or with, of all people, children, and they are people. Possession is 9/10 of the law. First come, first served. Haste makes waste. These are forms of speech we pull out in small crises with our young, but would think ridiculous to produce in a courtroom where serious matters are to be decided. Can you imagine a bailiff asking a jury if it has reached a decision and receiving the reply that to err is human but to forgive divine, or even better, let us render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's? For the briefest moment, the judge might be charmed, but if a serious language form is not immediately forthcoming, the jury may end up with a longer sentence than most guilty defendants. Lawyers, judges, and defendants do not regard proverbs or saying as a relevant response to legal disputes. In this, we are separated from the tribal chief by a media metaphor. For in a print-based courtroom where law books, briefs, citations, and other written materials define and organize the method of finding the truth, the oral tradition has lost much of its resonance. But not all of it. Testimony is expected to be given orally on the assumption that the spoken, not written word is a truer reflection of the state of mind of a witness. Indeed, in many courtrooms, jurors are not permitted to take notes, nor are they given written copies of the judge's explanation of the law. Jurors are expected to hear the truth, or its opposite, not to read it. Thus, we may say that there is a clash of resonance in our concept of legal truth. On one hand, there is residual belief in the power of speech and speech alone to carry the truth. On the other hand, there is much stronger belief in the authenticity of writing and in particular printing. The second belief has little tolerance for poetry, proverbs, sayings, parables, and other expressions of oral wisdom. The law is what legislators and judges have written. In our culture, lawyers do not have to be wise, they need to be well briefed. And he continues, and it's, again, well worth reading and rereading. Now, that is certainly a fun and productive rabbit trail, but what I want to focus on in this video are frames, and what are they? And you can see, basically, Postman's argument is that, well, even the medium frames the meaning, that this stuff isn't particular. Now, part of what's going on behind Stephen Woodford and Adam Friended and Jonathan Pageau is sort of a residual post-traumatic stress disorder in Western civilization about tyrannical Christianity. Fair warning, if my volume is louder right now, it's because I forgot to reset. I think Zoom always sets my mic levels at a certain level in this computer, and before I make these videos, I have to turn them up. So I won't reset them again. It should be fine for the rest of this video or this podcast. So sorry if the first part was a little low in terms of volume. But we have post-traumatic stress disorder in terms of Christianity in our culture, and so, and I think a lot of this is behind the fear of Christians, as if Jonathan Pageau is somehow going to take your family hostage. Well, if they all convert to Christianity and start going to a church and listening to a preacher, he very well might have that effect. But the point is that we're talking about frames, and Christianity is sort of seen as a frame, and it functions as a frame, but we're really not talking about one frame. And part of what I thought was helpful about Jonathan's performance in both of those conversations is he noted that the frame he is in some ways promoting is not really Christianity itself. It's really much more of a philosophical frame that through which Christianity and, in fact, other religions can be understood. One of the commenters on Jonathan's copy of the Rationality Rules video made the assertion that maybe Jonathan would do better if he simply asserted Platonism first and then sort of filled in some gaps underneath. I don't know that that necessarily would have been more helpful. But part of the reason I mention this is because if you want to sort of figure out what kind of frame Christianity is and how it functions, you really have to reckon with the enormous capacity of Christianity to function in a whole variety of cultural frames and philosophical frames. Peter Brown in his biography, and I don't have that on Kindle. Maybe I should look if it's put on Kindle by now, because I like Kindle because it's searchable for things. But Peter Brown's biography of Augustine that I read a number of years ago, I remember reading it and coming to the realization that Augustine of Hippo became a Christian for reasons very different from what modern Americans do. And I had the same realization recently when I was reading Justin Martyr. That when you read Justin Martyr, he embraced Christianity because it seemed to be the best philosophy. Augustine did pretty much the same thing. Well, what on earth do they mean by that? And we find Christian apologists today running around with arguments for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Well, why? Well, because of how that functions in our present cultural frame of late modernity and what we assert to be true. And so the physicality of Jesus leaving the tomb, and just again for your, in case this comes up as it always does, I believe that Jesus physically walked out of that grave. And I'm not just saying that to prop up my points with the fundamentalists out there. I believe it for other philosophical reasons. But the reason that modern apologists who want to promote Christianity keep arguing about the resurrection of Jesus, and the reason that Sam Harris bullies Jordan Peterson in their conversations about it, is because that's the way the plausibility structures of our present culture work. And the reason Jonathan Pageau was sort of having difficulty communing back and forth with Adam and Stephen was because Jonathan is approaching it from a very different cultural frame. But Christianity has seemed to adapt itself and accommodate itself quite nicely to a whole variety of cultural frames. That doesn't always mean that the fit is easiest or easier between or the same between all, but perhaps easier with some rather than others, making these frames, very coherent. And this Peter Brown in this book, Through the Eye of the Needle, which is all about money, wealth, the fall of the Roman Empire, and the making of Christianity. It's a fascinating book. When they spoke about wealth, Augustine and preachers like him spoke as the heirs of a very ancient world. The certitudes to which they appealed, and again, these certitudes are likely based on common sense or parabolic understanding, to which they appealed had bobbed up and down for over a millennia. And a veritable Saragossa sea of idées. It's probably French, and I don't have the book in front of me, so I can't look it up. Thus, basically, obviousnesses. let's say. Augustine propounded ideas about societies that were taken straight from the pagan classics. We should not think that he was doing this in a self-conscious effort to impress pagans with his culture or to woo them into the city by citing their favorite authors. He did it as unthinkingly as we today say that the earth is round. That's a very parabolic idea, frankly. And that the law of gravity is universal. It is true true truth about the social world in which he lived and which he shared with all other thinking persons of his age. He presented much of what he had to say on the topic of avarice, as on many other aspects of wealth, as a matter of common sense. Let us continue for a moment. Let's consider for a moment what this means. Over 30 years ago, the anthropologist Clifford Geertz showed us that common sense of a given society always depends upon a relative organized body of considered thought. But this thought was presented in a distinctive manner. As Geertz wrote in his essay, Common Sense as Cultural System, common sense wisdom is shameless and unapologetically ad hoc. It comes from epigrams, proverbs, obiter dicta, jokes, anecdotes, a clatter of gnomic utterances, not informal doctrines, axiomatic theories, or architectonic dogmas. And again, as Neil Postman noted, these things too change. And so if you want to look at our culture, and if you want to look at just simply the basis beneath the intuitive reflections, I mean, it's a plausibility system. That's another way to talk about it, that Stephen Woodford and Adam Friended are ensconced in. They're ensconced in these things, and they speak from these things, and Jonathan has had his own transformation, and so he speaks from a very different place. Now, you might say, well, they're all using electricity and have flush toilets and read Amazon books and are incredibly conversant in a lot of similar things. Yes, they are, but yet these cultural frames are very determinative of what they imagine to be good, bad, right, and wrong, many axiomatic things within their own systems. An ever-present adversary that we have to deal with is what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. And we should look back on, let's say, the Egyptians and their pyramids and their temples and their tombs that we open. Again, there's a very interesting program on Netflix about what they did, this tomb. And now this, again, these were rulers of the world. Just look at how powerful the Egyptians were in their time. Now, we might look back at Egyptians and imagine they were fools to invest so much of their gross domestic product on buildings, yet, well, we travel there and look at them with awe and not quite know what we're thinking. So, again, I just had this conversation with Poe. When I ask her, why did you become a mother, she's exactly right when she says, well, I can give you an answer, but I'm not at all certain that what? That's the answer. Well, what do you mean the answer? Well, this is how we are with ourselves. And Jordan Peterson made the observation. Why do we spend money traveling to New York when we can and visiting the Metropolitan Museum of Art? Why can there be a room with pictures that people painted a few hundred years ago, and the room is worth millions, if not billions of dollars? What's with that? We don't know, but something is going on, and we're not at all sure about what it is. And so we look at those pyramids and we think, well, maybe they should have fed their people or free their slaves or yada, yada, yada. But they ruled the world for thousands of years. And the pyramids and the temples were not incidental to their ruling of it. We say, well, maybe it was the Nile. Well, the Nile certainly had something to do with it, but they considered the Nile a god. And if you say, well, the Nile was vitally important for the power of Egypt, well, how did they know that? Without any science of economics or anything like that, they worshipped it as a god. Well, what did they mean by a god? Is economics a god to us? Look at all of our tall buildings and all of our bronze statues of all of things, a rather golden-colored bull on Wall Street. Why would we think of something like that a bull market and a bear market, and daddy's the knife, mommy's the fork, baby's the spoon. What are we doing? How does this work? Why do we do what we do? Why do we still invest in gold? You know, Tom Holland's video, if you haven't seen it, and that sounds terrible, but did religion exist in the ancient world? Everybody in their system believed that the temples were vital. Read Sun Tzu. Doesn't he basically say wars are won and lost in the temple? And we think, well, that's because, in an early modern phase, that's because of you have to use religion to propagandize and massively mobilize the people, and your army is dependent on the number of people, yada, 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 yada. Frames work to a degree. The sacrifices work. And again, when Jordan Peterson starts talking about sacrifices, and how the genetic and the cultural begin to intermingle, and over time these things rule the destiny of the world in some ways. If all the people of Africa are outproducing the selfish people of Europe who can't bother to have babies, well, who inherits the earth? It would seem to me the religious. And they're not necessarily looking at it as religion-s as we find it. No, this is how the world works. This is who inherits the earth. Now, we take these tiny little time slices and say, well, it's my little life. Well, maybe individualism is a terminal disease culturally. Well, people are flocking to America and other places because of individualism. Okay, well, maybe individualism isn't a terminal disease, but maybe it's sort of like smoking. It's a cultural carcinogen. So we live in the midst of this matrix of assumptions, common sense, and beliefs, and we do a whole lot of dead reckoning. What do I mean by dead reckoning? I mean if you're walking through the woods and you don't have any landmarks, or you just kind of have a sense of direction, and mine is, if you ask my family, notoriously bad. I know what it means to get lost, because I'm lost all the time, and it doesn't bother me, because at this point I've always been found, because here am I, aren't I? So we inherit groupthink because we have to dead reckon, and so we watch each other and we listen to each other and we intuit and all of this machinery that daddy's the knife, mommy's the fork, baby's the spoon, boys are dogs and girls are cats, and common sense and all of this stuff. We do it, and well, you know, COVID kicked up again. I knew it was going to kick up again because I went to Costco and there was no more toilet paper or paper towels, and I thought, didn't we figure this out the first time? But, hey, sure enough, I'm running out of paper towels. We inherit groupthink. We inherit values from parents and peers. We use common sense. We intuit relationships. We seek desire, security, comfort, and status. Just recently reading something on status where, you know, people just, you know, it's status we're dealing with. Oh, I'm losing power on my camera. Or maybe I'm not. We participate in this Durkheimian religious dynamic as groups to cohere, to cooperate, and to compete. And we're in the midst of it, but you know, you might have never heard of Durkheim, and you might never heard of this, but you sure do it. And even once you learn about Durkheim and these dynamics, you still do it. But if you're deeply religious, if it's way down in your motivational structure, like A Stitch in Time Saves Nine, or any of these other little aphorisms, or the meek inherit the earth. Well, and this is why you get a sense of Jesus, because anybody hearing that the meek inherit the earth that look around would say, hogwash. Yet we honor the Sermon on the Mount. But then to us as individuals, troubles come. And they come to all of us. Desires unmet, goals unreached, instability, betrayal, letdown, abandonment, communal or individual. A depression hits, an economic downturn, a pandemic, a war, environmental collapse, all kinds of things. Troubles come. If you're a person in the world, they do come. As I mentioned to Poe, I watched The Crown, and here's this young woman is, you know, brought into this family, and the whole idea behind the family. Why is Charles somehow qualified to be monarch because he's oldest in the family? We're working off a culture and a system that is so ancient, and that gives its gravitas. But, you know, it's so funny talking to those of you who are subjects of the crown, talking about your regard for the crown, but yet there it is, and it's awfully hard to get rid of. And why is that? And why all the pageantry? And why this young woman can be taken into their place? And because this husband of hers, you know, wasn't allowed to marry his soulmate or what have you, that her life was miserable, and it leads to this calamity that was her life. Via marriage, you've become one of the most privileged, wealthy, and powerful people in the world at age 18, but you're miserable, you're bulimic, you feel unloved, you have affairs like your husband, and it's still unacceptable, so you get out. My, are we strange creatures. We have demand and expectation. Well, we'll be happy if we get rid of expectation, but isn't expectation sort of the joy of life? Doesn't it kind of keep us moving forward? And this great scene from 28 Days, the Sandra Bullock movie, and that dude was in The Wire. I didn't know that back then. I've watched The Wire since then. No adult human being is happy. They are born. They have limited amount of time thinking that life is dandy, and then inevitable tragedy strikes, and they realize life equals loss. The whole point of the game is to minimize the pain caused by that equation. Isn't this spoken just right out of our frame? Right out of the default public frame? The point of the game is to minimize the pain caused by that equation. Now, some people do it by having kids or making money or taking up coin collecting. Meaning. Just have a goal and pursue it. That's Jordan Peterson's. I mean, if you listen to him, that's basically, okay, Jordan, you got 5 seconds to say it. Pick a goal and pursue it. The gyroscope of meaning. It will propel you into better things than where you are now. Well, what if that means wokeism? Others do it by getting wasted. But Sandra Bullock, she's not ready to... Gwen, her name is in the story. She's not ready to buy that. No. She sort of understands it's dead reckoning that coin collecting and making money and having kids and all of this stuff that we do is somehow meaningful, and getting wasted is anti-meaning. It's reciprocal narrowing, not reciprocal broadening. And even coin collection might lead you into history and meaning and all kinds of things. And having kids will certainly get you there. Nobody gets hurt coin collecting. She doesn't have the apparatus. Oh, so now we're into Jonathan Heitland. It's all about getting hurt or not getting hurt. Everybody hurts everybody, the boyfriend says. It's the human condition. Yeah. One of the real high points in the first wave of Jordan Peterson was the trip to Liberty University. And probably besides the poor guy rushing the stage, oh, that was a worthwhile trip that he made. No decadence in that stop. And then the conversation he had with David Nasser, which I thought was deeply fruitful, because, you know, here was Peterson at his inquisitive best, and David Nasser speaking, I think, with authority and credibility, wanting to know about transformations, wanting to know, as Peterson would often say, well, how can you beat an addiction? Well, often a religious conversion is powerful enough to do it, more powerful just than the assertion of your will. Few of us have will, but sort of from the bottom to retrain the elephant. Once the elephant catches Jesus or something else, the chatterbox on top will start saying different things. So these transformations are profound. The physical, psychological, and social realities may not have changed much. Inside, there is a new capacity to transcend the suffering, usually with strife. Outside, there's a new capacity to love, to forgive, to endure, to overcome. Now, we look at those things within our culture where there's a frame and say, yeah, that's improvement. Well, that improvement is framed too. This vision I just articulated is not neutral. It isn't self-evident. It isn't obvious. It isn't by definition well-being. We regard it as well-being. The ancient Greeks wouldn't have. Just read Tom Holland's treatment of the Spartans. The Spartans, if the Spartans were around today, they would be a persecuted people if you had the muscle to do it by the way that they lived. It is nested in a worldview, a value set. Reciprocal broadening, it is the opposite of suicide, which is one response to suffering. We look at almost universally, continually today, suicide as a malady. Why do we do so? Well, because we've got frames and frames and frames, and even the secular frame through which, rationally speaking, suicide should be a very valid, and there are people out there that'll say that, a very valid response to suffering. Well, but that's conditioned on far deeper things in the frame. And so when just recently, not very far from here, an 11-year-old boy shoots himself during an online class, we say there's something wrong with our culture. You're not saying he was precocious. And I agree with you. You're, as Chesterton and many others noted, you're outperforming your frame. There's ghosts and common sense and parables and things beneath you that you might not be able to find reason for, but there they are. And speaking for myself, thank God. The culture gives to the young what they haven't had a time to get on their own. And so when we start seeing children and teens killing themselves because they suffer, well, when we say that shouldn't happen, don't just therapize it away that, well, there's therapy involved and there's medicine involved, yada, yada, yada. But we have more medicine and therapy now than we had 20 years ago, and more of this. What's with that? It's not simple. Now, where are these frames located? And notice, those of you who are looking at the video, so you might be thinking picture frames, and that sort of works, but these are framed glasses, okay? Why do we use frames around glasses? And why are we using glasses? Well, we see through glasses. These frames are not physical. Where are they located? They're spiritual, like school spirit. And all the videos that I've talked about school spirit, it's you contribute to it. You're a dependent upon them. They are real enough to kill you. They command governments, economies, climates, future, markets. They command markets. Markets are very sensitive to these frames. They're not subject to your direct volition. You don't choose your frames. They chose you in the way that you grew up, etc. Although you do participate in their change. You do participate. And that's where, if you notice the rise of this word participation, it's sort of a middle voice word where there's some of it out there and some of it in here, and it's not all in here and it's not all out there. And again, the metaphors sort of arise at the affordance of the present technology that we're dealing with. I'm recording this on my PC, but I'll soon upload it to YouTube. And where does this video live? Well, what is this video? It's not a videotape that goes in someplace. So it's all these zeros and ones, and it's going to go out onto library and lbry.com if you're curious about that. And it's going to get blockchained all throughout all kinds of people's computers on the internet and stored there instead of servers on YouTube that can be taken down. Well, frames where are they located? Well, they govern. Well, where are they? Well, information. That's weak. You see the world through them. Now, as Jonathan Pageau noted, ethics are downstream from them. Stephen Woodford rightly noted that, well, these goals, these telos, they sort of determine your shoulds. And Jonathan Pageau keeps saying, okay, then what's your telos? And he couldn't say it. Well, why couldn't he say it? Either because he doesn't know it, or he doesn't know it very well, or because if he said it, he'd know that, well, he's an experienced enough debater. He'd know that he would be vulnerable to all sorts of other attacks because it's not terribly well formed, because it's too new. The ancient ones, well, they're sort of like open source software. The vulnerabilities have all been out there for a long time and have all the attacks and responses. What should you do depends on what is. What is? What you are, identity. Notice how that comes up. Again, read Charles Taylor. Where you live within the frame determines the good to strive for and the bad to avoid. There's a bunch of dead reckoning, and most of us agree on a whole bunch of things, like bad is being homeless and drug-addled or addicted. Well, you can reframe those things too. And good is, well, what? Well, it depends on the frame. And this stuff is enormously nuanced, enormously complex. But well-being, as Jordan Peterson asserted right from the start, is a non-starter because it's way downstream of frames. And basically what a lot of the celebrity atheists like to promote is that all the big questions have been answered. Have they really? It doesn't appear so to me. And that's why James Tour is in some ways a revelation, because he says, he's a organic chemist, and he says, people say that, oh, we know how life evolved. No, we don't. Who do I believe? Well, now we're back to Trump-Biden land. All conceptualizations of well-being exist within a frame and are dependent upon it. Remember, the frame is not physical. It's not purely psychological either. It's spiritual. It lives in the heavenlies, in a sense. You are dependent upon it, it's not directly subservient to your will. You don't really just go out and convert yourself and look at all the worldviews and say, ooh, I'll pick that one. It's a process that takes real time. The worldview colonizes you, not the other way around. You feel dependent upon it. You believe because of the frame. The frame owns you. You don't own the frame. You sort of are stewards of the frame with the other people of your frame tribe that you inhabit. But again, these are frames and frames and frames and frames nested with frames. Communally, you inherit it. You participate in it. And the real, it can kill you or give you life, status, privilege, joy, happiness, or despair. These are the things that govern us. To imagine that we're somehow rational and can decide what we believe and go on and make ourselves happy is one of the most stupid things I've ever heard. Because why? Watch people. Again, as a pastor, I observe that, and I'm not talking about atheists, I'm talking about Christians, I'm talking about normal people. We don't work this way. Why do we get on stage and pretend that this is utopia? It's a bankrupt effort. So we're all looking for a better frame, and that's true, and this includes Christians because, well, some Christians sort of sit still, but many don't. They continue. Look at me, 3 years into this thing, and my thinking is still evolving. Am I still a Christian? Yes. Do I think I'm a better Christian? Yes. Some of you might disagree. Who knows? But, the video that I made about the great puzzle, well, what is the great puzzle? Well, cultures are always looking for a better frame, a frame that fits. And so Jonathan Pageau adopts a new frame. Why? Well, he grew up evangelical, but he wrestled with all sorts of things. And you can talk to Jonathan about that. And he pursued art and began to realize that some of this other art was bankrupt, and he needed better art, and he needed better story. And he traveled the world, and he saw a lot of life. And he and his brother worked on these things. And well, they came up with their frame and his articulation of it. And it's a very ancient frame, but in some ways it's a modern adaptation, I'm sure, of it. But the world is glorious. The world is painful. How do we navigate? Science won't tell you how to walk through the cornfield. It won't tell you the best way because the scientific image has no value in it. Value rests in the manifest image. And that's why for every human being, the scientific frame is nested within the manifest frame because you're a human being. And, I was joking on Twitter the other day. There's a tweet basically that said, Sam Harris made me a Christian. Well, Sam Harris before was making Christians non-Christians because Sam Harris brought me to Jordan Peterson, brought me to Jonathan Pageau, to John Vervaeke, and to Paul Vanderklay, and now I'm a Christian going to church. I blame Sam Harris, he says. This thing got retweeted and retweeted and retweeted. It was a count, I think he less than 1,000, but probably less than 100 Twitter followers, but off it went. We do it whether we know we're doing it or not. We're always working on this frame, and we're always using this dead reckoning to try to figure out a better way to view the world. And so again, it builds up with common sense, with little aphorisms and little bits of evidence. But again, it's not just simply this referential evidence as in one-to-one thing out there. It's sort of an intuitive fittedness. And again, daddy's daddy's the knife, mommy's the fork, baby's the spoon. Boys are dogs and girls are cats. A stitch in time saves 9. That which goes around comes around. And then we use all these things to sort of piece it all together. The search is always religious, whether or not we recognize it to be. Now, I know some of you don't like philosophy, and some of you do. This video by Paul Maxwell on his old channel, Selfwire, is I think just a super helpful video. Daniel Bonovac has another history of philosophy video in an hour. This is a history, how any idiot can memorize the entire history of philosophy, and it's about a 30-minute video. It's a great video. He walks through things clearly, and if you begin to understand the framework of this philosophy, which is the love of wisdom, that's what philosophy means, philosophia. The love of wisdom. Well, what is wisdom? Wisdom is knowing how to get through the cornfield. Wisdom is knowing how to walk in the world. Wisdom is knowing how to navigate this world that is too large and too complex for us. And so wisdom has all of these little sayings beneath, and we build up from there. So you have metaphysics, which is metaphysics. It's beyond the physics, the things that go on their own. It's ontology, ultimate being, epistemology, knowing, axiology. Ethics. Ethics is far downstream from it. Well, how are we supposed to know the top level? Oh, well, we've been working on this for thousands of years. And is it ever anything we will grasp in our hand? Fundamental to Christianity and the idea of God says no. It is not something you will ever wield. It is not something you will ever exhaust with your little brain and the amount of time that you have to work on it. And in fact, if you look at Christian understanding, it is something that it will take you an eternity to pursue and joyously go into, further on and further up, deeper and deeper into God. Not a super thing floating around in a meta-divine structure, but God. And of course, the crying game moment when Stephen Woodford had to realize what kind of a person he was talking to. And that's when Woodford just was totally disoriented. Now, again, I hope that he goes back and thinks and watches more of Jonathan and has another conversation, because you're going to discover some things that are really amazing. Of course, philosophy is less mythological and more esoteric, which is why just a tiny little segment of people pay any attention to it. Everyone else is just going out and living their philosophy, for the better or worse. Now, I want to give you a story that talks about the power of frame and illustrates it well. Now, this might seem a bit of a mercenary thing because it's from the Christian. It's from Christianity, but hey, this is what I got to give. This is from John Ortberg's. I've read this before on my channel. John Ortberg's The Life You've Always Wanted, and you can find it on my blog, and I'll put the link below. I put it on my blog in October 2009. This is from John Ortberg's book, The Life You've Always Wanted. It's an amazing story he got from Tom Schmidt. It's on pages 24 to 28. The state-run convalescent hospital was not a pleasant place. It is large, understaffed, and overfilled with senile and helpless and lonely people who are waiting to die. On the brightest of days, it seems dark inside, and the smell of sickness and it smells of sickness and stale urine. I went there once or twice a week for 4 years, but I never wanted to go there. I always left with a sense of relief. It is not the kind of place one gets used to. On this particular day, I was walking in a hallway that I had not visited before, looking in vain for a few who were alive enough to receive a flower and a few words of encouragement. This hallway seemed to contain some of the worst cases, strapped into chairs and into wheelchairs and looking completely helpless. As I neared the end of this hallway, I saw an old woman strapped up in a wheelchair. Her face was an absolute horror. The empty stare and white pupils of her eyes told me that she was blind. A large hearing aid over one ear told me that she was almost deaf. One side of her face was being eaten by cancer. There was a discolored and running sore covering part of one cheek, and it had pushed her nose to one side, dropped one eye, and distorted her jaw so that what should have been the corner of her mouth was the bottom of her mouth. As a consequence, she drooled constantly. I was told later that when new nurses arrived, the supervisors would send them to feed this woman, thinking that if they could stand this sight, they could stand anything in the building. I also learned later that this woman was 89 years old and that she had been there, bedridden, blind, nearly deaf, and alone for 25 years. This was Mabel. Now again, someone might say, oh, suffering, we should put her out of her misery. Was she miserable? Wouldn't any of us be if we heard this description of ourselves? I don't know why I spoke to her. She looked less likely to respond than most of the people I saw in that hallway, but I put a flower in her hand and said, "Here, this flower is for you. Happy Mother's Day." She held the flower up to her face and tried to smell it, and then she spoke. And much to my surprise, her words, although somewhat garbled because of her deformity, were obviously produced by a clear mind. She said, "Thank you. It's lovely. But can I give it to someone else? I can't see it, you know. I'm blind." I said, "Of course." And I pushed her in her chair down the hallway to a place where I thought I could find some alert patients. I found one and I stopped the chair. Mabel held out the flower and said, "Here, this is from Jesus." That was when it began to dawn on me that this was not an ordinary human being. Later, I wheeled her back to her room and learned more about her history. She had grown up on a small farm that she managed with only her mother until her mother died. Then she ran the farm alone until 1950, when her blindness and sickness sent her to the convalescent hospital. For 25 years, she got weaker and sicker, with constant headaches, backaches, and stomach aches, and then the cancer came too. Her 3 roommates were all human vegetables who screamed occasionally but never talked. They often soiled their bedclothes, and because the hospital was understaffed, especially on Sundays when I usually visited, the stench was often overpowering. Mabel and I became friends over the next few years, and I went to see her once or twice a week for the next 3 years. Her first words to me were usually an offer of hard candy from a tissue box near her bed. Some days I would read to her from the Bible, and often I would pause. She would continue reciting the passage from memory, word for word. On other days, I took a book of hymns and would sing with her, and she would know all the words of the old songs. For Mabel, they were not merely exercises in memory. She would often stop mid-hymn and make a brief comment about the lyrics. She would have killed on YouTube. Make a brief comment about the lyrics she considered particularly relevant to her own situation. I never heard her speak of loneliness or pain except in the stress she placed on several lines in certain hymns. It was not many weeks before I turned from a sense that I was being helpful to a sense of wonder, and I would go to her with a pen and paper to write down the things she would say. During one hectic week of final exams, I was frustrated because my mind seemed pulled in 10 directions at once with all of the things I had to think about. A question occurred to me. What does Mabel have to think about? Hour after hour, day after day, week after week, not even able to know if it's day or night. So I went to her and asked, "Mabel, what do you think about when you lie here?" And she said, "I think about Jesus." I sat there and thought for a moment about the difficulty for me of thinking about Jesus for even 5 minutes, and this guy's studying to be a pastor. And I asked, "What do you think about Jesus?" She replied slowly and deliberately as I wrote, "I think about how good he's been to me. He's been awfully good to me in my life, you know. I'm one of those kind who's mostly satisfied. Lots of folks wouldn't care much for what I think. Lots of folks would think I'm kind of old-fashioned, but I don't care. I'd rather have Jesus. He's all the world to me." I feel a song coming on. And then Mabel began to sing an old hymn. Jesus is all the world to me. Notice how these little sayings just bubble up. I've seen that so often in visiting people with dementia or aphasia. I remember one member of the congregation, his wife would be in horror when she'd take him to church because he'd walk into church, he'd say, bullshit, bullshit. And she'd be, no, Pastor, I can't take him to. I said, let him say it in church. I had other jokes that popped up, and he would often at the end of a service like to come up and tell me a wry off-color joke at the end of the service, and that was him. But he lost much of his speech, but if you'd go and visit him with a hymnal, he'd sing. Jesus is all the world to me, my life, my joy, my all. He is my strength from day to day. Without him I would fall. When I am sad, to him I go. No other one can cheer me so. When I am sad, he makes me glad. He's my friend. Is this high poetry? Is it dumpy, campy, homey? This is not fiction. Incredible as it may seem, a human being really lived like this. I knew her. How could she do it? Seconds ticked and minutes crawled, and so did days and weeks and months and years of pain, without human company, without explanation of why it was happening, and she lay there and sang hymns. How could she do it? The answer, I think, is that Mabel had something that you and I don't have much of. She had power. Oh, we like talking about power now, don't we? And you would imagine that she is the least privileged person, certainly far less privileged than the Princess of Wales. Mabel had power. Lying there in that bed, unable to move, unable to see, unable to hear, unable to talk to anyone, she had incredible power. There was an ordinary human being who received supernatural power to do extraordinary things, miracles. Her existence was a miracle. Her joy was the miracle. Here was an entire life consisted of following Jesus as best she could in her situation, patient endurance of suffering, solitude, prayer, meditation on scriptures, worship, fellowship when it was possible, giving when she had a flower or a piece of candy to offer. Imagine being in her condition and saying, I think about how good he's been to me. He's been awfully good to me in my life, you know. I'm one of those kinds who is mostly satisfied. This is the 23rd Psalm come to life. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. For anyone who really saw Mabel, not like this camera could, that other seeing, who was willing to turn aside, a hospital bed became a burning bush, a place where this ordinary and pain-filled world was visited by the presence of God. When others saw a life in that hospital bed, they wanted to take off their shoes. The lid was off the terrarium. Then the turn came with a catch of the breath and a beating of the heart and tears. They were standing on holy ground. Do you believe such a life is possible for a normal human being? Where does such a life come from? Her life was framed by something. Her power came from that frame. Now, Langdon Gilkey wrote, really enjoyed this book, Shantung Compound. I've referred to it before because he's called Eric Ridley in the book. But the whole book is well worth reading. It's a short book. It's not very long. It's been around a while. It's the story of men and women under pressure. Here, basically, these were the business people and the diplomats and the missionaries that were in China during the Japanese attempt to consume China. And they were put together in an internment camp basically by the consular branch of the Japanese Empire, and they were treated much more humanely than prisoners of war or people in those kinds of conditions, but they were confined to a place too small, and it's really a remarkable book. If you enjoy shows like The Walking Dead, this would be a good one, because it's in some ways the same type of mental exercise. What do people do with each other under pressure? And Gilkey's a keen observer. He took notes. He was able to keep a journal while he was there, and right after the war, he wrote a lot of it down. It's really a very helpful book with a lot of wise observations. But frames are, of course, nested, and in the moments of time rise and fall in our consciousness field. Here, these people, their lives were interrupted by war, internment camp, but the normal textures of life come to the fore. And so all of the questions of character and personality and belief, all of the matrices sort of come together. Consciousness is sort of a framing, and consciousness is sort of a field, let's say, and notice how we're using metaphors. And other frames sort of surface and recess. And if our hunger will drive you to do certain things, and there's lots going on with these frames, coming up and coming down, and so many ways in order to sort of navigate from sort of the dead reckoning. I mean, I always tell my dog his God is his stomach, because my dog is very easily manipulated by food. And people are very easily manipulated by something. And so, in fact, the aspiration to grow a frame which is large enough in which the other frames will nest is actually a formula to live a life with directionality and meaning and purpose, and to accomplish something. Now, again, you don't need to know the word frame. This framing metaphor is relatively new, but basically, that's what religions have been doing for people throughout the history of the world, and philosophies. And whether or not you're conscious of your frame or your philosophy or your religion, you have one. It's the basic operating system to manage the enormity of the world. Now, there's an amazing part in this story, because this story is really about moving between frames, and so they're external conditions created frames which tested people, and when the war ends, there's really a very apocalyptic element where suddenly the world looks different, and the prison camp, the guards are different in the prison camp, and they know it, and the people know it, and all of the rules change. And you might imagine, well, physicality and bullets and threats of being shot are sort of the ultimate layer, but all of those guns are held by people, and frames hold the people. It seems to be no more obvious thing about this world. And then these American soldiers come parachuting down, and he talks about the fact that they are like gods in the camp. All of the men wanted to live in their approval, and all of the women wanted that and more. And suddenly there was a new reality in the camp, and you've got all these layers of culture and power, and everything just comes together. But the only terms Gilkey could use to actually talk about this were religious terms. Those were the metaphors that were at hand, and the ones that worked the best. There's this wonderful point in the book when a lot of the people swept up in this were missionaries and monks, and this one guy was the best. He was the best black market smuggler. He was a Trappist monk, and the Japanese eventually caught him. And again, the penalties weren't too severe, but they warned everyone they were going to make an example of him, so they sent him to solitary for a month and a half, and the rest of the monks just laughed their heads off, because for many of these monks, life in the camp was actually presented different challenges from what they had before. The minute I heard the news, the whole camp looked and felt and smelled differently. This was the end of the war. Now it was over, and all that was left was getting out. And much that had worried us for the future receded quickly into the past. Bert and I hurriedly discussed the political possibilities of our future. Would they land at Tsingtao? Would guerrillas take over the camp, and so on? I went back to the kitchen as into an unreal world. I found men debating, as we had done endlessly for 2 years, how long it would be now that the attack on Kyushu seemed certain to come. The news, of course, seeped around quickly enough. So don't tell anybody the war's over. Yeah, anybody's going to keep that secret? On Wednesday evening, more or less by unspoken word, all of the adults gathered outside the commandant's office hoping to hear some bulletin, if one came. If one did not, we intended to demand official word of some sort from the Japanese, for they had refused to utter one syllable on the subject since the first tidings had come in on Monday. While the whole camp was standing there, jovial but very tense and excited. Remember, the guards still have guns and bullets. There's still barbed wire around the camp. While the whole camp was standing there, jovial but very tense and excited, Mr. Watanabe came out of his office. He was a well-hated but secondary official, small, arrogant, and mean. At one time or another, about everyone had swarmed to himself to beat him black and blue when the war was over. When Mr. Watanabe saw this immense crowd, he turned ashen. Then, all in unison, bellowed, "There he is! Get him!" What had changed? What had changed? Everything had changed. Nothing had changed. They were demanding that the words match with the changing of frames. Struck with terror, Watanabe turned in panic and fled towards the Japanese quarters with his small sneaker-clad feet twinkling white over the ground. The sight of this hatred tormentor transformed before our eyes into a fleeting rabbit caused a howl of delight and laughter to rise. With that metamorphosis of our rulers, all threats on the lives and limbs of the guards vanished. Nothing was said officially that evening, but Watanabe's terrified flight was generally regarded as the most promising clue to the real state of things that we could have had. Although the coming victory had been a glorious event for which all longed, it had also had serious implication to those few who dared to ponder them. Who knew how an enraged Japanese soldiery might behave on the eve of certain defeat? Allied forces were 1,000 miles away by land. We were hundreds of miles from the nearest seaport. Did the Allies know we were here? Did anyone in authority care we were here? Could troops get to us in time if they did? Thursday, the day after Watanabe's flight, was weird. Everyone expected the end of our world to come. Yet in the moment, we were still absorbed in the trivia of camp life. Then on Friday, the end came as glorious a parousia. Now, he had Christian training, and he became a theologian eventually, but you can read Langdon Gilkey's Wikipedia to figure out how that went for him. A glorious parousia as the wildest biblical scenarist could have devised. The day, August 16, 1945, was clear, blue, and warm, such as a day should have been. We all began our chores by cooking, stoking, and cleaning up slops as usual. About the middle of the morning, however, word flashed around the camp that an Allied plane had been sighted. The clouds are going to part. 2 or 3 during the course of the war, we had seen one of our planes flying up in the upper atmosphere, a fast-moving silver speck far out of identification range. We felt sure they were Allied because of their solitary height and their speed, a vivid contrast to the Japanese planes that chugged along overhead burning, as one wag put it, coal balls. The plane had been sighted on Friday was evidently quite different. Or so a boy who spread the word came clear as he ran through the kitchen screaming in an almost insane excitement, "An American plane and headed straight for us." We all flung our stirring paddles down beside the cauldrons, left the carrots unchopped on the table, and tore after the boy to the ball field. You get visions of the book of Matthew with one will be taken, one will be left. That's the same idea. It's the same imagery, isn't it? This miracle was true. There it was, now big as a gull and heading for us from the western mountains. At this point, the excitement was too great for any of us to contain. It surged up within us, a flood of joyful feelings, sweeping aside all of our restraints, making us its captives. Suddenly, I realized that for some seconds I had been running around in circles, waving my hands in the air, shouting at the top of my lungs. On becoming aware of these antics, I looked around briefly to see how others were behaving. It was pandemonium. More so because everyone like me was looking up and shouting at the plane, and was unconscious of what he or she or anyone else was doing. Staid folks were embracing each others to whom they had barely spoken for 2 years. Proper middle-aged English men and women were cheering or swearing. Others were laughing hysterically or crying like babies. All were moved to an ecstasy of feeling that carried them quite out of their normal sense as the great plane banked over and circled 3 times. This was our plane. And then he talks about the American soldiers. It was, however, the women, or first we'll talk about the men. When gods came to visit the children of man, it was only to be expected that the men would readily obey their slightest wishes, and also that the women would be enraptured with them. Taken for granted in the pliable realm of mythology, such fantasies also turned out to be true in our mundane world when the moment was ripe. These 7 men who ruled the camp for the next 2 weeks were like gods among us. They were, in fact, as a group, large in physique, handsome, and capable. I suspect that whatever they had done as our rulers, they would have been the same. Had they not come from the clouds to save us? Had they not braved incredible dangers to do so? Did they not represent massive and unbelievable power? Were they not the fighting men who had won the war for us while we were cooking and stoking behind walls? Were they not tellers of wondrous tales, of marvels undreamed, of rockets and landing ships, of radar and atom bombs, to us who knew nothing of the technology of the war? Did they not look so strong and healthy, so virile, so different from the shrunken humanity we knew? And finally, did they not promise us that we would all be flown to our homes in China, America, and England as soon as the planes were available, the salvation for which we had yearned? The only frame of reference in terms of which their status among us and their effects on the camp can be understood was that of deity. One result was that the experienced British leaders of the camp, who in other circumstances would have little use for such youths, and American youths in particular, treated them like emperors. These usually impressive figures could be seen rushing about, doing silly little errands, compiling useless statistics, ever ready to accede to the slightest need or wish of the liberators. Middle-aged bankers who were in frequent contact with the heavenly court could be seen retailing the wonders of their wisdom to the little group of odd fellow internees who were not fortunate enough to deal with the newcomers directly. It was, however, the women of the status who instinctively recognized the women of the camp, their divine status. Of all ages, whether from high society or low, married or single, proper or not so proper, all wanted nothing better from life than to adore. They followed the pleasantly surprised soldiers everywhere, staring at them in rapture, edging up to get a word from there, fighting for a chance to wait on them, pushing their equally adoring children aside so as to be able slyly to touch or stroke them. As always, it was wonderful to have gods in our midst, unless, like the writer and a few others, you lost a girlfriend in the process. But apocalypse brings strange reversals. Oh, I thought I'd just had found the spot. Here we go. On a chilly gray day in mid-September, some 4 weeks after our rescue, a British colonel showed up to address the British subjects. As he said at the beginning of his speech, this would be a sobering hour for them, since his purpose was to tell them with all possible candor that the reality they had now faced would be like. Your small businesses in the cities of China, in the 3 years since you left, have been almost all destroyed beyond repair. Shops have been looted of their stock. Chinese merchants have moved into the premises. Go-downs have been ransacked, wrecked, and abandoned, and are almost useless. Everything that has not been shattered was passed into Chinese hands. There is little or no hope of reparations with which to get started again. Above all, I must say to you with all the force and authority of my command that the days of colonial life in Asia are over. Our rule in the treaty ports is a thing of the past. Favored treatment of foreign firms under British law is gone. Our control of residential areas has become impossible. Those of you who had worked for firms worldwide in scope can probably find work in your company's other offices, although you too must move from China. You are among the luckiest overseas British. Those of you, however, whose roots lie in China alone Had best resign yourselves to the loss of your old life. We cannot force you now to leave China. You may still find work here and there for the first time in Tientsin, in Shanghai, or as advisors to Chinese firms, but the future there is a bleak one for the self-employed Britisher. Our official advice to you is to give up East Asia, find refuge where you can with relatives in England, or seek new jobs in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and other places where the British life is still going on. An era has ended, and with it has ended your own past lives. I'm sorry, but those are the facts. And they were right. What changed? What rules the world? Pageau, in both of those videos, again and again, where do you stand? His primary image or representation here is spatial. He called out Bret Weinstein on this in that video back in 2017 with Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau and Bret Weinstein. Bret Weinstein kept saying higher, and Jonathan Pageau kept calling it. What do you mean higher? The point is, well, it's exaptation again, higher. We're referential creatures. But you always use metaphor when you're talking about the super sensible reality. That's why we're talking about frames, where you're thinking about a window frame or frames on a glasses. And this basically gets right into C.S. Lewis's point. And I've read most of this chapter in a previous video. You can find it in his book Miracles, in the chapter on horrid red things. Language the only kind of language available for super sensibles is metaphorical. When you talk about metaphorical truth, well, talk about someone, a super spreader, throwing the virus. It doesn't mean they get it in their hand and they throw it. It means they're throwing it. This is what we use for just about everything else. Exaptation, to employ this parabolic capacity. Things didn't start physical and later evolved to be mythical or metaphorical. They started united. Wind and air was the same thing. Now, if you try to work backwards, you're not going to get back to the same place. Later, a fork developed, and, well, we're on this side of the fork, but the fork itself is always framed within other realities. That's why, in some ways, wind and spirit still can sort of mean the same things, but we really strain to figure it out. What we're dealing with is, again, the loss of modernity. And, Dr. Jim was the one in a previous conversation really brought this to the fore. That's why the celebrity atheists arose when they did. They arose in many ways like fundamentalism arose in the end of the 19th century as a way to somehow try to cling on to receding Christendom. They felt it going away, and so what did they do? They, let's bring in the walls and let's try and hold ourselves off. Here's the tweet by Matthew Farrelly. How did I end up listening to Christians again? 2016, Sam Harris. Sam Harris to Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson to Rebel Wisdom. Rebel Wisdom to John Vervaeke. John Vervaeke to Jonathan Pageau and Paul Vanderklay. I blame Sam. Sam Harris paved the road to me. Go figure. Jordan Peterson, you have the Jordan Peterson allergy, which by the looks of some of the employees of Penguin Canada seems to be alive and well. Celebrity atheists, well, they get nervous about him. The Rationality Rules, Jordan Peterson's been making him itch for 3 years. And woke fundamentalists, and in many ways they are fundamentalists, because in some ways they're sort of the wave to come, but they're the old wave. Part of what Joey said early on with our meetups here is that a lot of these wokesters are really conservative. Well, what do you mean they're conservative? They're trying to preserve what their parents learned. Well, what is that? Well, think about that through. It's a good idea. And so when Jonathan Pageau rises, it's really the Lindy effect. It's really the reemergence of very ancient things. And if you look at, well, the religion that's not a religion and the work that John Vervaeke is doing, it's very ancient modern. It's all very ancient modern. The work of Jonathan Pageau, it's very ancient modern. Well, when modernity, which is a long, slow wave, sort of begins to recede, well, then all of the things that were below begin to emerge and you begin to see them from beneath the surface. So you have icons and Stoicism and Religio and all of those kinds of things. So I hope this helps understand a little bit of what we talk about when we talk about frames and basically how this conversation is working. I should have a big conclusion to it, but yeah. I wanted to get this out because, again, how can you understand these two? How can you understand these three? How can you understand the conversations as they're happening? Look at what they're trying to do. Look at what is implicit. Figure out, see if you can go back and, sort of what Jonathan Pageau says, see it phenomenologically. Don't be too concerned about the pictures. The pictures are there to try to inform your imagination. You're not going to be able to see it without the pictures. That's the only way we can apprehend it. But these things we are trying to apprehend, well, they're way beyond us, but they're built into us. Why was that language of Langston Gilkey so evident to us, and why does that language communicate to us? Were those American soldiers gods? How were they gods? What does that mean? If you meditate on these things, you can perhaps gain wisdom.